Written by Undeadlocklear. I used to have a close relationship with my uncle. He'd stop by as many times as he could, even though he lived way out in the boonies, another state away. Family was important to him, and it showed. He didn't have kids of his own, or a wife for that matter, so it was understandable that he was lonely and seeking support from his loved ones. He fished and hunted as a hobby and would always bring fish or deer jerky around for me and my brothers to eat. He was the nicest man I ever knew, and I saw him as more of a father figure than my real one. He'd tell us stories about what he'd find in the woods, all the weird people that he'd met, and even stories that I'm pretty sure he made up. One time he told us about a three-headed fish he caught. My brothers and I believed it at the time because we were young and believed everything he said. He was such a good storyteller, though. It was a shame he was cooped up in his cabin all the time, working whatever jobs he did, and never took to writing a book. I think he would have made a great writer. I would have preferred he become one instead of what happened. Our grandmother on my mom's side was an immigrant from India, and she had many superstitions. A lot of them were things everyone probably knows, like if you lie, your tongue gets shorter, or opening an umbrella in the house is bad luck. A rule she was very strict about, especially around my uncle, was that we weren't allowed to hear scary stories. Every time my uncle was close to telling us a horror story, either made up or for something he said he experienced personally, my grandmother would always come into the room and chastise him. She was always nearby whenever he came around, like she didn't trust him, maybe. Of course, I was always mad when she did this. It was just some tall tale or urban legend, right? Not like it can make anything happen. My uncle said as much to my grandmother. Her response didn't bother me until a few years later. She said, and I remember it so clearly, "Your fear makes demons real." My uncle didn't really respond, he just chuckled with a quiet okay. It didn't sound like he was brushing her off, though. It sounded like he was nervous. Soon after that, my uncle didn't visit for a while. We knew he was okay, though, because he called us often. Me and my brothers would crawl around a landline phone to listen to his stories late at night before bed. We missed him a lot. I missed him the most, I think. One night I asked him, begged him to come over sometime to play and tell stories to us again. He sighed and said, "That's not gonna be for a while, Squirt." I asked why, and he replied it was just work stuff, boring for a kid to hear. I whined, and eventually he let up. Okay. Let's see, I can see you guys in 3 Saturdays. Yeah, I'll see you the Saturday after the next. Deal? I yelled a yes into the phone, and did a weird dance that's too embarrassing to describe. After saying goodnight, I hung up the phone, and life went on until that Saturday. By then, me and my siblings were waiting impatiently for him to arrive. We were actually pestering our parents to tell us how much longer he would be, and it was becoming clear that they were both getting annoyed. Lucky for them, the doorbell rang. I was the one to yell, "I'll get it," and go racing towards the door to my uncle outside. But when I swung open the door, I barely recognized him. He was thinner. Not bone thin. He still had some muscle, but it was clear he had lost a lot of weight. His hair was trimmed, but his beard was longer and had some gray in it. He looked older overall, and he was supposed to be younger than my dad. He must have noticed that I looked confused because he knelt down to pinch my nose. He said, "Your mouth is gonna catch flies like that." His voice was what was enough to realize it was him. It was the only part of him that didn't really change. I hugged him, dragged him to the living room, and everyone exchanged hellos. My mom and dad commented on my uncle's drastic appearance change, mostly commending him on losing so much weight, and they all joked for a bit. My siblings and I hung out with our uncle until it was late. Then my dad turned on a movie to help us wind down. My brothers had already passed out halfway through the movie, along with my grandmother. My parents were in the kitchen, probably just talking. I looked at my uncle, and he was still awake. Getting a bright idea, I tugged his arm for attention. "Hey, can you tell me a scary story since Grandma's asleep?" He snorted at me. "You little troublemaker. Are you trying to get me in trouble? Besides, it's right before your bedtime. You won't sleep." "I'm not scared, and I won't tell anyone, not even Grandma. Just one scary story. Please." Me, being the adorable child I was, he gave in. All right. But only when you're in your room. I don't want your brothers to end up hearing and then get complaints from your mom or dad or grandma." So that's how it went. After the movie, my brothers were carried off to their shared bedroom and I went up to mine. After a while, where every adult in the house was saying their goodbyes, I love yous, and sweet dreams to the kids, my uncle came and sat in a chair next to my bed. Before he began, he said, "You sure you don't want to hear a funnier story?" To which I obviously declined. "All right then." Now, I'm not exactly as great of a storyteller as he was, so I might not remember the story word for word, but it went like this. One night, when I was outside on my porch, I was relaxing and smoking a cigarette, and I heard a little noise. At first, I thought it was an animal, because it really sounded like some sort of dog at first. I was thinking it was perhaps a fox, so I paid it no mind. Then, the noise began to happen more frequently. It went from sounding like an animal's yell to a person's scream. It was on and off, like they were taking short breaths in between. By this time, I had realized this wasn't no animal, that it was probably a person. I had to go get my gun just in case they were dangerous, and by the time I got back, the sound was even louder. I couldn't tell exactly what direction it was coming from, but as the sound got closer, I could tell. It came from around my home just to the right. It was pitch dark, and I couldn't see a thing, but I had my gun ready. It got closer and closer and closer, and soon it became very distinctively a human yell, a woman's yell. Soon I could hear something through the tree as well, right near the side of my house. It sounded like they were running, and their footsteps were heavy. The speed that the sound of their feet were making was disturbing, in that it was evenly paced but fast. Not a single sound that gave me the reason to think they needed time to breathe. By this point, I was already spooked, and might as well have been a featherweight away from pulling the trigger on someone. The footsteps were right at the edge of the woods now, but I still couldn't see. The sound went around to the side of my house and stopped, right near the porch where I was at. I realized they were hiding behind the wall. I didn't say anything for them to come out though, because I was frozen. What made me turn stone cold, however, was when they silently, but quickly, craned their neck to peek out from behind the wall. I stopped breathing. With the light of the house, I saw its face. Completely pale skin with a yellow pallor. Its skin looked saggy, and its dark hair was long and wet from what I assumed was sweat. Its eyes, though, Jesus Lord Almighty, they looked ready to pop out of its head. Not that it had any support anyway, because its eyelids were sagging just as much as the rest of its face. Its lips were a dark red on the inside, but pale and chapped on the outside. I stayed there, still as a board, as both me and it stared at each other. I started shaking, but what made me move was when the head moved from being at the bottom of the porch to eye level with me. Then I knew it was time to move. I ran into the house, locked the door, and shut all the windows. For extra measure, I turned on all the lights. I stayed in my kitchen the entire night, gun in hand, not even blinking. I had to keep an ear out to make sure it didn't get in, and I couldn't sleep because I was afraid it would get the jump on me. So I stayed up all night like that, staring and listening until sunrise. But I still installed a security system immediately after that. It was the scariest moment of my life. He seemed to think after that, staring at his hands for a bit. After that, he looked up at me. He could tell that I was actually very afraid. Suddenly, he burst out laughing. Not loud, but enough to wake me from the miniature nightmare I was having inside my head. Ah, shit, Shorty. Sorry, I knew I shouldn't have told you that late at night. Don't worry, it wasn't real. All made up. He patted my arm, but I was a little scared. Can you stay in here a little while until I fall asleep? He must have been feeling guilty, and I felt a little guilty for making him feel guilty, but he agreed to stay with me for a little while. As I started to doze off, I heard him say one last thing. It's all just made up. His voice sounded more like he was convincing himself rather than me. I woke up not too long after, still in the middle of the night, but my uncle wasn't there anymore. Obviously, I was afraid, so I got up to head to either my parents' or my grandmother's room, because I didn't know where my uncle was sleeping or if he was even still here. Before I could leave my room, though, I heard it. Just like my uncle said, the small noise. I heard it again too, and then again and again and again. I was frozen, just like my uncle. I was frozen and I couldn't move. Then the noise got closer and sounded more like a scream, just like I had imagined in the story. For some reason, for some dumb, stupid reason, I walked to my window. I stopped right at it, my hand hovering over the curtains. The noise got closer. I gripped the curtains. It got closer. I started shaking. It wasn't at my window, but it was outside. It was probably right in the yard. I could hear it yelling, "Why wasn't anyone else waking up?" Taking a few shaking breaths, I began to peel the curtain away, but when I peeked outside, it was pitch black, and I could barely see the yard. But from what I could see, nothing was there. I started to feel relief until a sudden, silent movement right at the corner of my window made me stop breathing. That thing was staring right at me, peeking at me through the window, pale yellow skin sagging off the bones, greasy dark hair, bulging eyes. I nearly pissed myself. After a long time of just us staring at each other, I began to slowly inch myself towards the door. Its eyes followed me, and as I was halfway there, it moved. From the corner of my window to the center of it. I can barely comprehend what I was seeing. Its neck was long and sagging like the rest of it. From what I could see of its shoulders, it looked like chicken skin, actual chicken skin, slimy and prickled. I kept backing up until I was out of the room and slowly closed the door. Then I ran to my grandmother's room and started banging on the door. I woke up the whole house because I began to scream. Everyone came after me asking what was wrong, but I couldn't tell them. I didn't want my uncle to get in trouble. I just told them someone was at my window. My dad got a bat and searched outside, but found nothing. My uncle showed up then and stared at me. We looked at each other and we both knew. My grandmother went to go make me some tea, and my uncle was the one holding me on the couch after that. My brothers were confused and cried a little too, but my mom put them back to sleep. I looked at my uncle and said, "I saw it." He frowned visibly and started rocking me, and I could feel him shaking. It was hard to go to sleep after that. The cops were called and they kept looking but found nobody. Me and my uncle were alone in what we saw. My uncle stopped coming around after that. We got calls from him every so often, but they started to get less and less. Soon I only heard about him through my dad. Then, a few years later, we heard that he had died of alcohol poisoning in his home. I think he was trying to keep that thing away from us, because I didn't see it again after that night. Until the day he died, that is. At his funeral service, I saw it in a window. It didn't see me, I don't think, but it was looking at him in his casket. I hear it more often now. I hear it when I'm alone, when I'm with my boyfriend, or even if I'm not sleeping in my house. It follows me. It followed my uncle too until he died. I don't want to die. So, maybe now, it'll be too preoccupied with all of you.